Imagine breathing air so rich, so saturated with oxygen, that a single lightning strike could turn an entire forest into an ocean of flame. Now imagine that this was not a disaster. It was normal. 350 million years ago, Earth was not the world we know. It was not blue skies over grassy plains. There were no birds, no mammals, no flowering plants, no sound of insects buzzing through summer air as we recognize it. Instead, the planet exhaled something heavier, thicker, more powerful. This was the Carboniferous, a time when the air itself was rewriting the rules of life. To understand how giants would rise, we have to step into a world that feels almost alien. Not another planet, but another version of Earth. The continents were not where they are today. What we now call North America and Europe were drifting slowly together, grinding across the planet's crust in a collision that would eventually help form the supercontinent Pangaea. To the south, Gondwana stretched across polar regions, beginning a slow descent into glaciation. These massive landmasses did not move in silence. Their collisions raised mountains, redirected winds, altered ocean currents, and reshaped global climate. Over tens of millions of years, something remarkable formed near the equator. A vast, humid, stable climate belt. It was warm, it was wet, and it barely changed. And inside that narrow band of stability, the Earth built something extraordinary. The coal forests. Imagine standing on ground that is not quite solid. Every step sinks slightly into layers of damp vegetation. The air is thick with moisture. Not mist, but weight. It clings to your skin. Sunlight struggles to penetrate the canopy above, diffused through layers of towering plants unlike anything alive today. There are no oak trees, no pines, no flowers. Instead, colossal lycopods rise 30 meters into the sky, their bark patterned like scales. Giant horsetails grow as thick as tree trunks. Ferns stretch outward in endless repetition, fronds overlapping like a green cathedral ceiling. The forest floor is dim, quiet, humid, and everywhere. Life breathes slowly. Photosynthesis was happening here on a planetary scale. These forests were vast beyond comprehension. They stretched across what is now North America and Europe, forming dense swamp ecosystems that pulsed with growth year-round. Dead plant material did not fully decompose in the oxygen-poor waters below. Instead, it accumulated, layer upon layer. Over millions of years, those layers would compress into coal. The fuel that would later power human industry was born in this ancient greenhouse. But something else was happening in the air above those swamps. Oxygen levels were rising. Today, Earth's atmosphere contains about 21% oxygen. It is enough to sustain complex life, but safely below the threshold where fire becomes uncontrollable. During the late Carboniferous, oxygen concentrations climbed toward 35%. It remains the highest sustained atmospheric oxygen level in the history of the planet. That number sounds abstract, but its consequences were anything but. Air, at 35% oxygen, behaves differently. Fire ignites more easily. Flames burn hotter and spread faster. A dry branch struck by lightning could erupt into inferno within seconds. Geological evidence preserved in fossil charcoal layers across ancient coal beds tells a clear story. Wildfires swept these forests periodically. Not once, not rarely, but in repeating cycles across hundreds of thousands of years. The planet grew forests, and then burned them, then grew them again. It was a feedback loop of life and destruction. Carbon locked away in vegetation, fire releasing it, regrowth drawing it back from the atmosphere. And all the while, Oxygen remained high, but fire was only the visible consequence. The deeper transformation was biological. Oxygen is not just fuel for flames. It is fuel for metabolism. Every animal cell depends on oxygen to extract energy efficiently from nutrients. More oxygen means more potential energy. More energy means greater metabolic capacity, greater growth. Yet life does not expand infinitely. It is constrained by physics. Diffusion. Before lungs evolved in vertebrates, before complex circulatory systems dominated terrestrial ecosystems, many organisms relied on simple diffusion to move oxygen into their bodies. Gas molecules travel from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. But diffusion works efficiently only across short distances. That is why small bodies thrive under simple respiratory systems. As body size increases, internal tissues sit farther from the surface. Oxygen must travel deeper. Eventually, diffusion alone cannot supply enough. Unless the air changes. At 35% oxygen, the concentration gradient between atmosphere and tissue increases dramatically. Oxygen molecules penetrate farther and faster. What was once a limiting factor becomes an enabling force. The carboniferous atmosphere did not just support life. It expanded the boundary of what life could become. Higher atmospheric pressure also increased air density. For flying organisms, though few yet existed, denser air would provide more lift per wing beat. Movement through the atmosphere required less energy. The medium itself offered assistance. But we are not there yet. Because before wings filled the skies, the earth had to build the stage. The coal forests were not static landscapes. They were dynamic engines of atmospheric chemistry. As every leaf contributed to oxygen accumulation, every root system stabilized wetlands that locked carbon underground. Yet even in this abundance, instability lingered. As continental collisions progressed, mountain ranges rose. Ocean circulation shifted. Polar ice began to expand across southern landmasses. Subtle changes in global climate patterns began to fracture the once continuous equatorial wet belt. The stability that had allowed oxygen to rise would not last forever. But for millions of years, it held. And in that window of atmospheric excess, evolution experimented. Small arthropods crawled through leaf litter thick as mattresses. Primitive insects scuttled beneath decaying trunks. Early amphibians lurked near stagnant pools. Most were modest in size, at first, because evolution does not leap. It tests. It nudges. It waits. Generations passed in this oxygen-rich world. Mutations that allowed slightly larger size no longer carried immediate respiratory penalties. Individuals with broader bodies or thicker exoskeletons could survive. They could move more efficiently. They could overpower smaller competitors. Predation intensified. Competition sharpened. And somewhere within that quiet, humid forest, something began to scale upward. The shift was subtle at first. A millimeter here, a centimeter there. Fossilized remains show gradual increases over geological time. Arthropods expanded segment by segment. Exoskeletons thickened. Compound eyes grew larger. Legs lengthened. In the canopy above, early winged insects tested primitive flight. The dense air supported them. Each beat required less energy than it would under modern atmospheric conditions. The sky was no longer an unreachable barrier. It was a navigable space. The forest had built giants in waiting. But nature rarely grants advantage without consequence. Higher oxygen increases metabolic rate, but it also increases oxidative stress. Cells exposed to excessive oxygen face chemical instability. Tissues become vulnerable to damage. The balance between growth and destruction becomes delicate. The Carboniferous was a planet walking that line. Life flourished in abundance, Yet the same chemical richness that fueled expansion also primed ecosystems for catastrophe. Lightning storms ignited fires that raced through dry intervals. When flames consumed forests, ash settled into wetlands. Regrowth followed. The cycle repeated. Through it all, the air remained thick, and evolution continued its slow escalation. The smallest creatures on Earth were no longer confined by the same invisible ceilings that limit them today. There is something unsettling about that realization. We often think of physical laws as constants, size limits, biological ceilings, rules that seem fixed, but those rules depend on context. Change the air, and you change the possible. By the late Carboniferous, the stage was fully set, an equatorial world of endless swamp forests, an atmosphere richer in oxygen than at any other time in Earth's history, a climate stable enough to sustain growth, yet volatile enough to burn. And within that charged environment, life stood at the threshold of exaggeration. The sky above the ferns was still mostly empty. The forest floor still belonged to creatures small enough to vanish beneath a fallen frond. But the pressure was building. Because when the air itself becomes an evolutionary accelerator, limits begin to dissolve. And when limits dissolve, scale transforms. The Carboniferous was not just an ancient chapter of Earth's history. It was a laboratory, a planetary experiment in atmospheric excess. And the results would soon rise on wings nearly 70 centimeters wide. The ground would tremble beneath segmented armor more than 2 meters long. Predators would emerge from shadows where oxygen fed their muscles like hidden fire. But those giants were not born in a moment. They were born in the air. And as long as that air remained thick, warm, and heavy with oxygen, nothing on Earth could stop them from growing until the planet itself decided to change. There was no sudden explosion, no single generation where insects woke up enormous. The transformation was quieter than that. It happened molecule by molecule, breath by breath. To understand why the Carboniferous produced giants, we have to look inside the smallest creatures alive at the time. Not at their claws, not at their wings, but at their breathing. Unlike mammals, insects do not have lungs. There is no chest rising and falling, no diaphragm pulling air inward, no bloodstream carrying oxygen from alveoli to distant tissues. Instead, insects breathe through a system that seems almost primitive. Tiny openings along their bodies, called spiracles, allow air to enter directly. From there, a network of branching tubes, tracheae, spreads throughout their tissues. These tubes subdivide again and again into finer structures called tracheoles, reaching almost every cell. Oxygen does not hitch a ride in blood, it simply diffuses. From high concentration to low, from outside to inside. That simplicity is both elegant and limiting. Diffusion is governed by physics. The farther oxygen must travel, the longer it takes. As body size increases, the inner tissues lie deeper from the surface. At some point, oxygen cannot penetrate fast enough to meet metabolic demand. That is why most modern insects remain small. Their respiratory system imposes a ceiling, but the Carboniferous shattered that ceiling. When atmospheric oxygen rose to nearly 35%, the partial pressure of oxygen increased dramatically. The gradient between air and tissue intensified. Oxygen molecules moved faster and deeper into bodies than they ever could under modern conditions. Imagine placing a sponge in shallow water. Now imagine submerging it in a deep, dense ocean. Absorption changes. Cells that once struggled to receive adequate oxygen were suddenly saturated. The University of Arizona's diffusion models suggest that oxygen penetration depth could have nearly doubled under Carboniferous atmospheric conditions. That is not a minor shift. That is a biological revolution. Suddenly, a body twice as thick no longer suffocated from within. Metabolism could scale upward. Muscles could enlarge. Exoskeletons could thicken. Energy was no longer the bottleneck. And oxygen was not only abundant, it was dense. Higher oxygen concentration increases overall air density. Denser air behaves differently. For creatures experimenting with flight, this mattered enormously. In today's atmosphere, flying demands significant energy. Wings must beat rapidly to generate sufficient lift. But in a denser atmosphere, lift increases. The same wing surface produces more upward force. Paleo-aerodynamic simulations suggest that under Carboniferous conditions, the energetic cost of flight could have dropped by as much as 20 to 25% compared to modern air. That means larger wings were not a burden. They were an advantage, and nature responds to advantage. It does not hesitate. Evolution does not plan ahead. It selects what survives. And in a world where oxygen was abundant and air thick enough to support heavier bodies, larger size began to confer dominance. Larger eyes capture more light. Larger wings travel farther. Larger mandibles overpower rivals. Predators with longer reach hunt more efficiently. Herbivores with thicker armor resist attack. What had once been constrained by invisible respiratory limits was now unleashed. The air itself became an evolutionary architect, but oxygen's influence went deeper still. Cellular respiration, the process by which organisms convert nutrients into usable energy, depends directly on oxygen availability. When oxygen concentration rises, cells can increase ATP production efficiency. More ATP means more available biological energy. More energy means faster growth, stronger musculature, and enhanced recovery. Insects under experimental hyperoxic conditions today, environments with elevated oxygen, show measurable increases in body size compared to those raised in normal air. The Carboniferous was a hyperoxic planet, not artificially, naturally, for millions of years. But there is a paradox here. Too much oxygen can be dangerous. Reactive oxygen species, unstable molecules formed during high metabolic activity, damage proteins, DNA, and cell membranes. Modern organisms evolved antioxidant defenses to mitigate this damage, but under extreme oxygen levels, oxidative stress increases. The Carboniferous atmosphere walked a fine line between abundance and instability, yet evolution found a temporary equilibrium. Because no vertebrate competitors had yet evolved sophisticated aerial dominance. No birds filled the sky. No reptiles glided between trees. The airspace was empty, and oxygen made it accessible. Flight itself was still relatively new in evolutionary terms. Early winged insects were experimenting with body plans. Primitive wing articulation systems allowed for gliding and basic flapping. But under modern atmospheric conditions, such early forms might have struggled to achieve sustained flight. Under Carboniferous air, even inefficient wings could lift heavier bodies. The medium was forgiving. That forgiveness accelerated innovation. Wing venation patterns became more intricate, strengthening structure without excessive weight. And indirect flight muscles, anchored to the thorax rather than directly to the wings, allowed more powerful and sustained wing beats. These adaptations were not independent of oxygen. They were enabled by it. In dense, oxygen-rich air, biomechanics shifted. Imagine trying to swim in water versus running through thin mountain air. The environment defines the effort. In the Carboniferous, the atmosphere became a support system rather than a constraint, and so size escalated. But size alone does not guarantee survival. It changes ecological dynamics. Increased oxygen allowed for stronger predation pressure. Predators could grow larger and more active. Prey species responded in turn. Thicker exoskeletons, faster reflexes, improved sensory organs. An evolutionary arms race began. But unlike modern ecosystems, the Carboniferous lacked certain checks and balances. No birds to prey on flying insects, no small mammals to diversify ground-level competition. Amphibians were present, but many remained tied to water. Arthropods dominated terrestrial ecosystems in ways difficult to imagine today. The forest floor was a battleground of segmented bodies. Above, the air waited to be claimed. And the more oxygen filled that air, the more viable gigantism became. There is a concept in evolutionary biology called constraint release. When a limiting factor is removed, traits that were once suppressed can expand. For insects, respiratory limitation had long constrained body size. The Carboniferous removed that constraint. But constraint release is temporary because environments do not remain static. They shift. They oscillate. They collapse. Yet for tens of millions of years, oxygen remained high enough to sustain large-bodied arthropods. It was not merely that insects could grow bigger. It was that they could sustain that size without catastrophic metabolic failure. Under modern oxygen levels, a dragonfly the size of a hawk would struggle to supply its muscles with sufficient oxygen through diffusion alone. Its internal tissues would face hypoxia. Flight would be energetically unsustainable. But in Carboniferous air, diffusion was amplified. Muscle fibers received sufficient oxygen even at greater depths. Energy output scaled. The sky became a viable hunting ground for larger forms, and evolution seized that opening. It is tempting to imagine that these giants were monstrous aberrations. But in their time, they were normal. They were optimized for their environment. In fact, under 35% oxygen, small size may have been less advantageous than we assume. Larger body mass provides thermal stability, greater momentum, broader sensory input. When oxygen ceases to be limiting, the cost-benefit balance shifts. Scale becomes a tool. The atmosphere did not merely permit gigantism, it incentivized it. Yet embedded within this advantage was fragility, because insects lacked lungs. They lacked active ventilation systems capable of compensating for declining oxygen levels. Their respiratory systems were efficient under high concentration gradients, but highly sensitive to atmospheric change. If oxygen were to decrease, diffusion rates would fall. Internal tissues would struggle. Large bodies, once sustainable, would become liabilities. Gigantism under diffusion-based respiration is stable only within narrow atmospheric boundaries. The Carboniferous had accidentally constructed those boundaries, but the planet was not finished evolving. Continental drift continued. Polar ice expanded. Climate patterns destabilized. And the oxygen curve, once climbing, would eventually begin to fall. When it did, the very mechanism that allowed giants to thrive would turn against them. But that collapse lay in the future. For now, the air remained thick. The forests remained vast. And somewhere above the canopy, shadows were beginning to form. Not clouds, not smoke, wings. Because when oxygen became the architect of biology, evolution drafted new blueprints. And the next generation would not crawl quietly beneath the ferns. They would dominate the sky. The sky did not darken all at once. It happened in flickers, a shadow crossing the canopy, a rush of displaced air, a shape too large to belong to the world we know. By the late Carboniferous, the experiment had reached its peak. The forests were thick. The atmosphere was saturated. Oxygen hovered near levels Earth would never see again. And evolution had answered. It answered with giants. The sky belonged to Meganeura. If you had stood beneath the canopy and looked up, you might have seen something glide between the shafts of filtered light. Wings. Not delicate, not fragile, but broad, structured, commanding. Meganeura, an ancient relative of modern dragonflies, but yet nothing like the fragile insects that skim over ponds today. Its wings stretched nearly 70 centimeters across. That is wider than many hawks. Its body was long and muscular, armored in a segmented exoskeleton that shimmered slightly in the humid air. Two immense compound eyes dominated its head, each composed of thousands of lenses. Together, they formed one of the most sophisticated visual systems of its time. It did not hover lazily. It hunted. In the dense carboniferous air, flight was not a strain. Denser atmosphere meant more lift per wing beat. The energy required to remain aloft was lower than it would be today. Paleo-aerodynamic reconstructions suggest that a creature of Meganeura's size could sustain powered flight under 35% oxygen, something nearly impossible in modern atmospheric conditions. Its wings were reinforced by intricate venation patterns, balancing strength and flexibility. Indirect flight muscles attached to its thoracic structure allowed powerful, stable strokes. When it accelerated, it did so like a spear launched from the canopy. Smaller insects, and even juvenile amphibians, were not safe beneath its gaze. Its compound eyes detected motion with extraordinary precision. Movement triggered pursuit. Pursuit ended in capture. Serrated mandibles snapped shut. In a world without birds, without bats, without aerial vertebrate competition, Meganeura reigned as apex predator of the skies. The Carboniferous had given it everything it needed: oxygen to fuel its muscles, dense air to carry its wings, a forest ecosystem teeming with prey. The sky was no longer empty. It had a ruler. The forest floor trembled, but the Carboniferous was not ruled from above alone. Beneath the towering lycopods and giant ferns, something even more unsettling moved through the shadows. It did not fly. It did not leap. It advanced, segment by segment. Arthropleura. Stretching more than 2 meters long, this colossal millipede-like arthropod remains the largest land invertebrate ever discovered in Earth's fossil record. Imagine a body armored in overlapping plates, each segment bearing a pair of legs that moved in rhythmic coordination. Dozens of limbs lifting and falling in synchronized waves. The forest floor, thick with decaying vegetation, parted beneath its passage. Trackways discovered in Scotland reveal impressions over 1/2 meter wide. Of fossilized remains show a creature both massive and meticulously engineered. Despite its size, Arthropleura was not a predator. Jaw fragments and gut analysis suggest a herbivorous diet, feeding on leaf litter, fungi, and decomposing plant matter. It was a recycler, a processor of the forest's endless organic debris. But do not mistake herbivory for vulnerability. At over 2 meters long, encased in hardened exoskeleton reinforced with mineral deposits, Arthropleura had few natural threats. Its respiratory system relied on diffusion through spiracles, just like smaller arthropods. Under modern oxygen levels, a body that size would struggle to supply deep tissues with adequate oxygen. But in the Carboniferous, diffusion was amplified. The air itself sustained it. Each cell within its vast, segmented body received enough oxygen to maintain metabolism. Its mass, once impossible, became viable, and as it moved across the damp forest floor, the ground seemed to ripple beneath its weight. The Carboniferous had produced a terrestrial titan, the assassin in the shadows. Yet even Arthropleura was not the most formidable creature lurking beneath the canopy. In darker hollows, where moisture gathered and visibility dropped, another predator waited. Pulmonoscorpius, a giant scorpion nearly 1 meter long. Unlike earlier arthropods that relied purely on tracheal diffusion, Pulmonoscorpius possessed an evolutionary innovation: primitive book lungs, layered respiratory structures that increase surface area for gas exchange, more efficient than simple tracheal systems. A transitional design between primitive diffusion and more advanced respiration. This mattered because oxygen abundance had not merely allowed size, it had allowed specialization. Pulmonale scorpius was not just large, it was engineered for violence. Its front pincers were powerful, capable of exerting crushing force sufficient to immobilize prey quickly. Its segmented tail arched overhead, tipped with a venomous stinger. Fossil evidence suggests the presence of neurotoxins potent enough to paralyze smaller animals in seconds. In the humid darkness, it stalked silently. Unlike Meganeura, which dominated the open air, Pulmonoscorpius ruled confined spaces. Root systems, fallen logs, shadowed depressions. The Carboniferous ecosystem was vertically stratified: sky, canopy, forest floor, substrate. And at each level, oxygen-fed giants claimed dominance. An age of exaggeration. Taken together, Meganeura, Arthropleura, and Pulmonoscorpius represent something extraordinary. Not isolated anomalies, but a pattern. The Carboniferous was an age of biological exaggeration. Size escalated across multiple arthropod lineages simultaneously. Dragonflies grew enormous, millipedes lengthened. Scorpions expanded. Even centipedes and beetle ancestors showed trends toward increased scale. This was not coincidence. It was atmospheric permission. Oxygen had removed the respiratory constraint that normally caps insect body size. Once released, evolution explored the new upper limits rapidly. And in the absence of vertebrate aerial predators, these giants faced little opposition. Amphibians existed, yes. Early tetrapods prowled near waterways, but they were often constrained by their own physiological dependencies: skin that required moisture, reproduction tied to aquatic environments. Arthropods were more adaptable. Exoskeletons protected them from desiccation. Segmented bodies allowed modular scaling. Diffusion-based respiration thrived under high oxygen concentration. The ecosystem tilted in their favor. For tens of millions of years, arthropods dominated terrestrial ecosystems more completely than they ever would again. The world belonged to segmented exoskeletons and compound eyes. But excess always carries tension. Because oxygen, though abundant, was unstable. High oxygen increased wildfire frequency. A single lightning strike could ignite dry intervals in the forest canopy, triggering infernos that swept across entire regions. Fossil charcoal layers confirm cycles of combustion repeated throughout the period. Oxygen was giver of life and agent of destruction. The very chemical that enabled gigantism also primed ecosystems for catastrophe. Forests burned, regrew, burned again. Yet the giants persisted, for now. The illusion of permanence. To any observer living within that era, gigantism would not have seemed temporary. It would have felt normal, dominant, stable. Meganeura slicing through thick air above, Arthropleura advancing through leaf litter below. Pulmonoscorpius poised in ambush, each perfectly adapted to its niche, each sustained by invisible atmospheric abundance, but their dominance rested on a narrow chemical threshold. Their respiratory systems were passive. They lacked lungs capable of compensating for declining oxygen levels. They lacked circulatory systems designed for fluctuating atmospheric pressure. Their size was sustainable only under extraordinary conditions that would not last. The continental collisions that created the Carboniferous climate were still unfolding. Mountain ranges rose higher. Ocean currents shifted more dramatically. Polar ice expanded across southern latitudes. The stable, humid belt that sustained coal forests began to fracture. And when the forests fractured, oxygen production would decline. But the giants did not know this. They hunted, they fed, they reproduced, unaware that their empire depended on a single atmospheric variable. Yet there is something unsettling about that. Because evolution often builds magnificence atop fragility. The Carboniferous giants were not monstrous accidents. They were logical outcomes of their environment, but their greatness was conditional. Remove oxygen abundance, and scale becomes burden. Remove dense air, and wings lose advantage. Remove stable wetlands, and food webs collapse. The age of giants reached its zenith in silence. No ceremony marked its peak. No warning sign signaled its end. Yet the conditions that allowed arthropods to dominate the planet were already beginning to shift beneath the surface of tectonic plates. Because the planet was still moving. And when Earth moves, empires fall. Empires do not collapse in a single day. They unravel, slowly, silently, from forces no creature within them can see. For tens of millions of years, the Carboniferous world had remained warm, humid, and saturated with oxygen. Coal forests stretched across equatorial regions like an unbroken green ocean. Arthropod giants ruled sky and soil, but beneath their feet, the planet was still shifting. Continents were converging. What had once been separate landmasses, Laurussia in the north and Gondwana in the south, were grinding together in a collision measured not in years, but in geological time. Mountains rose. The early ancestors of the Appalachians thrust upward in North America. The Urals formed across what is now Russia. Massive chains of rock altered atmospheric circulation patterns that had once been stable for millions of years. Ocean currents were redirected. Wind belts shifted, and the equatorial wet zone, the lifeblood of the coal forests, began to fragment. At first, the changes were subtle. Seasonal variation increased slightly. Dry intervals lengthened. Wetlands that had remained perpetually saturated began to experience brief droughts. But ecosystems built on stability do not tolerate instability well. The coal forests depended on constant humidity. Their dense plant life locked carbon underground, preventing full decomposition. That carbon burial had fueled the rise in atmospheric oxygen. When forests remained intact, oxygen climbed. When forests burned or died, oxygen declined. It was a delicate chemical equilibrium. And now, that equilibrium was breaking. As continental drift continued, the merging landmasses formed the supercontinent Pangaea, a single colossal expanse covering nearly half the planet's surface. Such size altered climate dramatically. Large continental interiors trap heat in summer and lose it in winter. Moist ocean air struggles to penetrate far inland. Rainfall patterns become uneven. Monsoons intensify in some regions and vanish in others. Meanwhile, in the southern hemisphere, Gondwana drifted over the South Pole. Ice sheets expanded. Glaciers advanced. As polar ice grew, global sea levels dropped. Coastal wetlands receded. The shallow swamp ecosystems that had defined the Carboniferous began to shrink. The coal forests, once continuous across thousands of kilometers, fractured into isolated patches. What had been a seamless green world became a chain of ecological islands separated by expanding dry plains. This event has a name in paleontology: the collapse of the coal rainforests. Around 305 million years ago, one of the most profound ecological transitions in Earth's history unfolded. Forests that had dominated for millions of years disappeared within a geological blink. Plant diversity plummeted. Moisture-dependent species struggled. Fire regimes intensified in drying regions, and with forest collapse came atmospheric change. Because those forests were not just ecosystems, they were oxygen factories. When they thrived, photosynthesis removed carbon dioxide and released oxygen into the atmosphere. When they died and decomposed under different climatic conditions, that balance shifted. Carbon dioxide rose. Oxygen began to fall, from 35% to 30 to 27, and eventually near 23% by the early Permian. To modern humans, a few percentage points might seem insignificant. But for organisms whose entire respiratory system depends on diffusion gradients, that drop was catastrophic. The giants had been built for abundance. Now abundance was fading. The suffocation of scale insects do not actively pump oxygen deep into their tissues the way mammals do. They rely on passive diffusion. When atmospheric oxygen concentration decreases, the diffusion gradient weakens. Oxygen molecules move more slowly into the body. Internal tissues receive less supply. For small insects, this is manageable. For giants, it is devastating. Then a body 2 meters long requires oxygen to travel far greater distances to reach its deepest cells. Under 35% oxygen, that was possible. Under 23%, it becomes borderline. Under continued decline, impossible. Imagine a city designed with wide highways to accommodate heavy traffic. Now imagine those highways narrowing year by year. Eventually, congestion builds, supply chains falter, energy distribution fails. That is what happened inside the bodies of the Carboniferous giants. Their massive exoskeletons, once advantages, became burdens. Larger muscles required more oxygen. Thicker tissues lay farther from spiracles. Diffusion could no longer sustain metabolic demand. Growth slowed. Reproduction rates declined. Large-bodied individuals faced higher mortality. The fossil record preserves this shift. Body size in many arthropod lineages begins to trend downward during this transitional period. It is not an abrupt disappearance. It is shrinkage. Gigantism did not explode into extinction overnight. It contracted. Generation after generation, selection favored smaller forms, individuals whose bodies demanded less oxygen. The atmosphere was rewriting the rules again. But this time, in reverse. Fragmented worlds. The collapse of the coal rainforests did more than reduce oxygen. It shattered habitats. Species once able to roam vast, continuous swamps now found themselves isolated within shrinking wet refuges. Isolation accelerates evolutionary pressure. Populations diverge. Some adapt to drier conditions. Others vanish. Arthropod giants, specialized for humid, oxygen-rich environments, faced multiple stressors simultaneously. Declining oxygen, fragmented ecosystems, increasing seasonality, greater temperature fluctuations. Their empire was unraveling from every direction. And as forests receded, new ecological spaces emerged. Dry uplands expanded. Open environments replaced dense canopy. These landscapes favored a different kind of organism, one less dependent on moisture, one equipped with lungs, one capable of active ventilation. The early reptiles. Unlike amphibians, reptiles had evolved amniotic eggs, self-contained aquatic environments that allowed reproduction away from water. Their skin reduced desiccation. Their lungs allowed active breathing independent of atmospheric diffusion limits. As oxygen levels declined and forests fragmented, reptiles gained advantage. They were smaller at first, modest, unassuming, but they did not rely on passive diffusion through tiny spiracles. They inhaled, they exhaled, they controlled their respiration. In a world where oxygen was decreasing, that control mattered. The balance of power shifted quietly. While arthropods shrank, reptiles diversified. The Carboniferous was giving way to the Permian. The age of arthropods was ending. Fire, ice, and final contraction. The final stages of collapse were not gentle. As climate oscillated between wetter and drier intervals, wildfire frequency spiked in some regions. Drought-stressed vegetation ignited more easily. Without continuous swamp systems to buffer flames, fires spread unpredictably. Meanwhile, glaciation in southern continents continued to disrupt global climate stability. Sea levels fluctuated dramatically. Shoreline ecosystems collapsed. Marine oxygen levels shifted in response to atmospheric changes. The biosphere entered turbulence. For giant insects, turbulence meant vulnerability. Large size is advantageous only when energy is abundant and environmental stability persists. Under stress, small size is safer, requires less food, less oxygen, less territory. Evolution is not sentimental. It does not preserve magnificence for aesthetic reasons. It preserves what survives. And what survived the collapse were smaller arthropods, more adaptable forms. The giants faded from the fossil record, not in a blaze of singular catastrophe, but in steady decline. By the early Permian, the age of dragonflies with 70-centimeter wingspans had ended. The forests that birthed them were gone. The air that sustained them had thinned. Their dominance had been conditional, and the condition had expired. The turning of the planet. There is a striking paradox in this story. The same tectonic collisions that helped create the humid equatorial belt and allowed oxygen to rise ultimately destroyed it. The same atmospheric excess that fueled gigantism intensified wildfire cycles. The same forests that built the giants became victims of climatic instability. Creation and destruction were not separate chapters. They were part of the same geological narrative. The Carboniferous did not end with an asteroid. It ended with imbalance. A slow shift in climate. A gradual reconfiguration of atmospheric chemistry. A reminder that even the most dominant lifeforms are bound to environmental thresholds. The air giveth, the air taketh away. By the time the Permian dawned fully, Earth was a different world. Drier, more seasonal, more continental. Reptiles expanded into niches once dominated by amphibians and arthropods. Over tens of millions of years, that lineage would give rise to something even larger than the insects that once ruled. But that was still in the future. For now, the Carboniferous giants were gone. Their legacy buried in coal seams beneath our feet. Compressed forests turned to fossil fuel. Charcoal layers marking ancient fires. Trackways pressed into stone where 2-meter arthropods once crawled. The world of giants had collapsed. Not because they were weak, not because they were flawed, but because the atmosphere changed. And when the atmosphere changes, life must follow, or disappear. Extinction rarely looks dramatic from the inside. There is no trumpet blast, no sudden silence, no single day when the last giant falls. Instead, it begins with subtle failure, a missed hunt, a slower recovery, eggs that do not hatch, a body that grows just slightly smaller than the generation before. The fall of the Carboniferous giants was not an explosion, it was suffocation. When size became a liability. For millions of years, large bodies had been an advantage. More reach, more strength, more territory. But under declining oxygen levels, every additional centimeter became a burden. And imagine trying to breathe through a narrow straw while running uphill. Now imagine that straw shrinking year by year. For insects dependent on passive diffusion, reduced atmospheric oxygen meant weaker concentration gradients. Oxygen moved more slowly into tissues. The deepest muscles, those powering wings or supporting massive exoskeletons, began to experience chronic hypoxia. Cells starved, metabolism slowed, muscle fibers could no longer sustain peak performance. A meganeura with wings spanning 70 centimeters required immense energy to launch into flight. Under 35% oxygen, that energy was accessible. Under 23%, flight became costly. Under 21%, modern levels, it would become nearly impossible. Natural selection does not debate. It eliminates inefficiency. Larger individuals that required more oxygen died sooner. Smaller variants, even slightly smaller, had survival advantage, and so the trend reversed. Gigantism began to shrink. Fossil records across late Carboniferous and early Permian strata show measurable reductions in arthropod body size. Dragonflies grew smaller. Millipedes shortened. Giant scorpions disappeared. The decline was consistent across continents. The air had turned against them. Ecological dominoes. But oxygen was not the only factor. As coal forests fragmented, food webs destabilized, herbivores dependent on dense wet vegetation found fewer resources. Arthropleura, once surrounded by endless decaying plant matter, now encountered patchy habitats. Isolation intensified competition. Smaller bodies required less food, required less oxygen, required less territory. The environment was selecting for compact efficiency. Meanwhile, predators that once relied on ambush within dense ferns found themselves exposed in more open landscapes. Pulmonoscorpius and its relatives faced shrinking refuges. Dry conditions limited prey availability. Increased seasonality meant harsher winters and hotter summers. Large exoskeletons retain heat. In fluctuating climates, that is not always beneficial. The Carboniferous giants had been optimized for stability. The Permian introduced variability. And variability punishes specialization. The rise of a new strategy. While arthropods contracted, another lineage expanded. Early reptiles. Small at first, agile, unassuming, but revolutionary in one crucial way. They breathed differently. Unlike insects relying on spiracles and passive diffusion, reptiles possessed lungs capable of active ventilation. Muscles expanded and compressed thoracic cavities, drawing air in and forcing it out. This meant they were less dependent on ambient oxygen concentration. They could compensate, at least partially, for atmospheric fluctuations. In a declining oxygen world, that flexibility mattered. Reptiles also possessed amniotic eggs, self-contained life support systems allowing reproduction far from water. They were not tethered to humid wetlands. As coal forests collapsed and dry uplands expanded, reptiles moved in. Not because they were stronger, but because they were adaptable. Evolution does not reward dominance. It rewards adaptability. The Carboniferous giants had been supreme under one atmospheric regime, but when that regime shifted, supremacy meant nothing. A geological blink. From our perspective, the fall of the giants seems drawn out across millions of years, but in geological terms, it was abrupt. Within a relatively short window, perhaps only a few million years, the fossil record shows clear decline in maximum insect body size. By the early Permian, the era of meter-long arthropods had ended. No more 2-meter millipedes. No more scorpions the size of dogs. No more dragonflies casting eagle-sized shadows. The skies did not remain empty for long, but they would not again belong to insects of such magnitude. The age of arthropod titans closed quietly, and something else was waiting. From shrinkage to silence, there is a haunting quality to evolutionary decline, because unlike sudden mass extinctions triggered by asteroid impacts or supervolcanoes, the Carboniferous collapse was driven by atmospheric chemistry. No single catastrophic event marks the extinction of giant insects. Instead, they fade, smaller and smaller until their former scale becomes biologically impossible. Oxygen stabilized near modern levels, and with it, a new respiratory ceiling locked into place. From that moment forward, diffusion-based respiration imposed hard limits on body size. Gigantism was no longer viable. Even if modern dragonflies could genetically choose to grow to 70 centimeters again, physics would prevent them. The atmosphere would not allow it. The invisible ceiling returned. The evolutionary reset. The fall of the giants was not merely loss. It was reset. As arthropods shrank, reptiles diversified explosively. Dry environments favored upright posture, efficient locomotion, stronger jaws, more complex ecosystems. From small early reptiles would emerge synapsids, then archosaurs, and eventually, millions of years later, the dinosaurs. There is irony in this. The collapse of one age of giants opened the door for another. But the mechanism differed. Dinosaur gigantism was supported by advanced lungs, active ventilation, and sophisticated circulatory systems. They did not depend on extraordinary oxygen levels. They engineered their own internal solutions. The Carboniferous giants had relied on atmospheric generosity. The Mesozoic giants would rely on physiological innovation. The lesson is profound. Environment can create opportunity, but internal adaptation determines longevity. The fragility of dominance. There is something humbling about the Carboniferous story. For tens of millions of years, arthropods dominated terrestrial ecosystems more completely than at any other time in Earth's history. If an observer had stood within that world, they might have assumed insect gigantism was permanent, unstoppable, the natural order. But the natural order is conditional. It rests on invisible variables: temperature, moisture, atmospheric composition, planetary chemistry. Change those variables slightly, and empires dissolve. The Carboniferous teaches us that even the most powerful biological dynasties can depend on something as intangible as air. The giants were not defeated in battle. They were undone by physics, by diffusion limits, by atmospheric decline, by the narrowing of possibility. The last shadow. Imagine the final generations of giant dragonflies gliding over forests already thinning. Imagine Arthropleura moving through habitats no longer continuous. Imagine scorpions whose offspring hatch smaller than themselves. No one marked the moment. No monument stands for the last of them. They vanished not in spectacle, but in quiet inevitability. And in their place, smaller insects persisted, more modest, more constrained. The world moved forward. Evolution did not mourn, it pivoted. But there is a question that lingers. If atmospheric oxygen once rose high enough to unleash gigantism, if a small chemical shift could rewrite biological limits, what would happen if it happened again? Would modern insects expand once more? Would ceilings lift? Would the shadows return? The Carboniferous giants are gone, but the mechanism that created them still exists, and the air, though invisible, remains the most powerful evolutionary force on Earth. The giants are gone. Their wings no longer darken the sky. Their armored bodies no longer press into wet forest floors. Their venom no longer waits in the shadows. But the force that created them is still here. We breathe it every second. Invisible, silent, unnoticed. Oxygen. The Carboniferous was not magic, it was chemistry. And chemistry can change again. The variable we forget today, Earth's atmosphere contains about 21% oxygen. It feels stable, permanent, safe, but it is neither permanent nor guaranteed. Throughout Earth's history, oxygen levels have fluctuated dramatically. They have risen, fallen, stabilized, shifted again. Atmospheric composition is not fixed. It is the result of planetary processes: photosynthesis, carbon burial, volcanic activity, tectonic rearrangement, ocean circulation. Change those systems, and you change the air. Researchers at institutions like the University of Exeter have modeled scenarios where oxygen levels could theoretically rise above 30% again under certain ecological conditions. It is not likely in the near future, but it is possible within Earth's long-term planetary cycles. And if that happened, biology would respond. Breaking the ceiling again. Modern insects are small not because evolution prefers smallness. They are small because physics demands it. Diffusion-based respiration imposes a limit. At 21% oxygen, there is only so much distance oxygen molecules can travel efficiently inside an insect's body. increase atmospheric oxygen to 30% or higher, and the diffusion gradient strengthens. Penetration depth increases. Internal hypoxia decreases. Metabolic ceiling rises. The same constraint that once capped insect size would loosen. We have experimental evidence of this. In controlled laboratory environments, the insects raised in oxygen-enriched atmospheres grow larger than their counterparts in normal air. Their tracheal systems expand differently. Their body proportions adjust. Size scales upward, modestly but measurably. Now imagine that not in a laboratory chamber, but planet-wide, for millions of years. Selection would begin to favor larger individuals once again. Predation dynamics would shift. Flight energetics would change. Denser air means more lift. Wings would not need to beat as rapidly to stay aloft. A dragonfly twice its current size would not struggle the way it would today. The ceiling would move, not instantly, not explosively, but generation by generation. A familiar world. Rewritten picture, a temperate forest, thousands of years into a hyperoxic future. As the trees look familiar, the rivers still flow. Humans still walk beneath the canopy, but something hums overhead, deeper than the buzz we know. Dragonflies the size of small birds patrol wetlands. Beetles with shells broader than your hand crawl through leaf litter. Centipedes stretch longer than your forearm. Not monstrous, not mythical, just scaled. Physics allows it. The question is not whether insects could grow larger again. They could. The question is how ecosystems would respond. Because size alters power. Larger predators hunt differently. Larger herbivores consume differently. Pollination patterns shift. Food webs restructure. Even wildfire behavior could change. Higher oxygen levels increase flammability. Forests become more combustible. The Carboniferous wildfire cycles remind us of that. An oxygen-rich world burns more easily, so the return of gigantism would not be an isolated phenomenon. It would signal deeper planetary transformation. The human factor. There is another unsettling dimension. Humans evolved under 21% oxygen. Our physiology is tuned to it. Our lungs, our blood chemistry, our cellular antioxidant systems. Higher oxygen concentration increases oxidative stress in human tissues. It elevates fire risk in urban environments. It changes combustion dynamics in industry. An oxygen-rich world would not simply grow larger insects. It would challenge human infrastructure. Metal corrodes faster in oxygen-rich environments. Fires ignite more readily. Explosions become more violent. Even small sparks could escalate rapidly. The Carboniferous taught us that oxygen abundance is double-edged. It fuels life. It fuels destruction. The air that empowers growth also amplifies risk. Evolution never stops. But perhaps the most profound implication is not about insects. It is about limits. We often assume biological boundaries are fixed, that insects are small, that certain body plans cannot scale, that evolutionary possibilities have been exhausted. The Carboniferous proves otherwise. Limits are environmental. Change the environment, and limits shift. If oxygen were to rise again, evolution would experiment again. It might not replicate the past exactly. Modern ecosystems contain birds, bats, mammals, competitors and predators absent in the Carboniferous. Those factors would shape outcomes differently. Gigantism might emerge in specific niches rather than dominate entire ecosystems. Or it might be constrained by new evolutionary pressures. But it would not be ignored. Evolution never ignores opportunity. The fragile balance. There is a delicate equilibrium embedded in Earth's atmosphere. Too little oxygen and complex life struggles. Too much oxygen and fire consumes ecosystems while oxidative stress destabilizes cells. The Carboniferous balanced near the upper edge of that threshold. It demonstrated what happens when the dial turns upward. Gigantism, wildfire cycles, atmospheric volatility, then collapse. Stability returned, but at lower oxygen levels. The giants vanished, the ceiling reasserted itself, and life continued within new boundaries. The invisible sovereign. We rarely think about air. We see oceans, mountains, forests. But air is intangible, transparent, yet it governs everything. It determines how large lungs must be, how fast muscles can contract, how quickly fires spread, how tall mountains can support vegetation. It even shapes the sound of wings. The Carboniferous giants were not accidents. They were products of atmospheric generosity. When the generosity faded, so did they. The lesson is both simple and profound. Life does not dominate the planet. It negotiates with it, and the atmosphere holds veto power. A future written in breath. If oxygen levels rose again, whether through natural geological cycles millions of years from now, or through unforeseen planetary transformations, Earth would not simply look the same with bigger insects. It would be a different planet. A planet closer, in some ways, to its ancient self. Forests might grow differently. Fires might burn hotter. Evolutionary pathways once closed might reopen. And somewhere above a humid wetland, a shadow might pass that feels strangely familiar. Not a bird, not a bat, but something older. A reminder that biology is elastic, that size is conditional, that what seems impossible today was once ordinary, and could be again. The Carboniferous was not merely a prehistoric curiosity. It was a demonstration, a planetary proof of concept. Change the air, and you change the limits of life. We often imagine evolution as a slow sculptor carving stone. But sometimes, it is the atmosphere that hands evolution new tools. The most powerful force in Earth's history is not always visible. It does not roar. It does not crash. It does not announce itself. It surrounds us, enters our lungs, feeds our cells, and quietly determines how large life is allowed to become. The giants of the Carboniferous are gone, but their story lingers in every breath we take, because the air we breathe today is the only thing standing between our world and theirs.